Hello, my name is Mackenzie Guerin, and I am a second-year law student at the University of Minnesota Law School and a staffer on the Minnesota Journal of International Law. Today, I'm having a conversation with Professor Fionnuala ní Aolain. Professor ní Aolain is a Regents University professor at the University of Minnesota and holds the Robina Chair in Law, Public Policy, and Society. She's also the faculty director for the law school's Human Rights Center and holds a concurrent appointment as professor of law at Queen's University Belfast School of Law. Professor ní Aolain served a 6-year term from 2017 to 2023. I said that wrong. We'll start again.
Go back.
Yep. Professor ní Aolain served a 6-year term from 2017 to 2023 as the United Nations Special Rapporteur on the promotion and protection of human rights and fundamental freedoms while countering terrorism. In 2023, she was elected to the International Commission of Jurists, and in 2024 received a lifetime appointment as Honorary King's Counsel by His Majesty the King of England. Last month, in December 2025, Professor ní Aolain was appointed as a member of the United Nations Independent International Commission of Inquiry on the Syrian Arab Republic, where she will be involved in investigating alleged violations of international human rights law. Wonderful. I'd like to begin our conversation by talking about your visit to Syria in 2023 as part of your special rapporteur mandate. Can you speak about the context of that visit and what you learned while you were there?
Sure. So that visit was complicated in an obvious sense because, of course, the Assad regime was still in power. And in fact, the negotiations for that visit started long before. I had started speaking with my team in the first instance, but also with states about the wisdom of visiting the Syrian Arab Republic at an early point in my mandate. And the reason it was complicated was, of course, the regime was isolated, it was under sanction, and there's always a fear that if you are a UN independent expert or a UN body and you visit a country that has egregious human rights violations, that you are in fact sort of propping up or giving legitimacy to the regime. So there's this really complicated question about, before we even get to the actual visit, of figuring out whether or not it's a wise thing to do. And my mandate had been particularly concerned. Syria, of course, had a long-standing issue of terrorism, and the organization, the designated terrorist organization Daesh, ISIS, had proclaimed its caliphate on the territory of Syria and Iraq. And there had been a long-standing campaign to essentially get rid of that organization, take it out of functioning, and remove the security threat that it provided to multiple states. But at the same time, the issue I was concerned about was particularly what was happening in northeast Syria, which was the existence of a series of camps and detention centers that emerged at the fall of the caliphate, and which, at my estimate, had upwards of 70,000 men, women, and children being detained without trial in conditions that at least I instinctively felt met the threshold for torture under international law. And so my visit was really an attempt to access that territory, which no one else had accessed, and to visit those prisons, which had not been visited. But the priors were this really complicated question of the wisdom of going, of a long-standing engagement. In order to get into a country, you have to negotiate with the government in power, even if that government in power is deeply repressive. So there were a whole set of moral and ethical complexities about the prior negotiations. And maybe finally to say the other complexity of that visit before we got there was that, of course, Syria, while it's a sovereign state, or while it is a sovereign state, at the time had several countries which had presence on its territory. So as well as the Russian Federation, the Iranians had a presence, the US had a military base, and Turkey had taken a sizable piece of territory in order to defend its own national security imperatives. So we were talking to the state that we needed to get permission from to go in, but also there was a series of sub-negotiations with all of these states who had military presence on the territory that I would have to negotiate access with, as well as the non-state armed groups. So it was really complicated, actually.
Quite a bit of advocacy. My understanding is that while you were there, you were able to gain access to some of the detention facilities, and you learned some pretty remarkably tragic facts about the people who were in detention. Given that insight that you gained from actually being there, what legal and non-legal strategies proved effective afterwards at helping return and repatriate individuals who were detained there and otherwise strengthen compliance with human rights norms in the region?
Yeah, it's a lot of questions. So what I would say is that gaining access once we were physically on the territory was really quite difficult. There are two large camps, Al-Hol and Al-Raj in northeast. So we first went to Damascus, traveled overland because there was no access by air, traveled overland to Damascus and then took an internal UN humanitarian flight from Damascus to northeast Syria. And then once we were on the territory in northeast Syria, we were in the hands effectively of the non-state armed group, the Syrian Democratic Forces and the Peshmerga, the YPG, who are kind of the military wing of, part of the military wing of the SDF. So in theory, of course, we had agreed access, but access is always negotiated in situ. And the first two camps I wanted access to were Al-Hol and Al-Raj. These are the largest two camps. They're prisons, effectively. Al-Hol is like a town. It's so enormous. We estimated at the time that there were upwards of 40,000 men, women, and children being detained there. The largest detention facility for children anywhere in the world. And the conditions were really grim. They were, as we anticipated, that in my legal view, they met the threshold for torture and cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment. But also I had real concerns about core crimes being committed in the camps. There's a smaller camp called Al-Raj that mostly contains third country nationals, so women and children from other countries, not Syria or Iraq. And then the prisons, which are really, there are 25, we believed, prisons or places of detention. So it's a system of detention and people do move between them. So we got access to several prisons, including two detention facilities where adolescent boys were being held. And that was, I think, extremely difficult. I think I interviewed upwards of 100 teenage boys, ranging from 11 years old to some were above 18, but had been detained while children. And the most complex prison I visited was a prison called Panorama, which is the prison where the alleged remnants of ISIL are detained. And these were all, one portion, the argument is that these men were fighters and they were essentially picked up and then brought to detention at the end of hostilities. There are 500 boys in that prison, so boys who were in detention, brought into detention with their dads or were transferred into that prison. The conditions were horrific. There was widespread TB. My estimate was that there were 75% of the population had TB. So, I mean, the obvious point is there are really huge risks of visiting a prison like that for your own and my team's exposure to like serious illness. But also, I think the thing that was most disturbing about the prison was that we identified that there was widespread starvation. So deliberate starvation of the population, allied with non-treatment of TB, which of course results for most of the population in inevitable death. So clearly not consistent with the rule of law. And I suppose the really important thing to say is that prison is enabled and supported by Western forces, particularly by the United States. So you have a prison facility run, enabled. In fact, Panorama Prison was built by the United Kingdom down to the square plugs in the rooms that we visited. So you've got a prison which holds men that their countries won't bring back, which is subcontracted to a non-state group, which treats them in these horrific ways. So we wrote a report. I then issued a second report to the General Assembly. And maybe to say on your question about like after, I think the after is really hard. I think we haven't seen major departures, let's say, from Panorama Prison. No attempt to address the obvious arbitrary detention of these men. Humanitarian conditions did improve somewhat, not least because my position with these governments was that they were in fact responsible for these core crimes by virtue of facilitating and enabling the detention. So Western states get pretty nervous when they're accused of war crimes, and that in some sense had this effect of making sure the men were fed. But we've had no other independent expert have access to that prison. So the answer is, do we really know if it's better? I don't think we do. On the broader question of repatriation, it still remains very fraught. We've had a change in regime in Damascus. And it's pretty clear that large numbers of Syrians and Iraqis are going home. But third country nationals remain sort of pretty solidly entrenched because their countries of origin won't take them. So yeah, the after is not a good news story. Mm-hmm. And it speaks to the broader demise we're seeing in states' willingness to implement their international law obligations.
Public discourse about terrorism can often intersect with narratives about gender. In my own research in Central Asia, I was really struck by how specific ideas about women and girls actually facilitated the return of individuals mm-hmm. who were detained in Syria, yeah. and in some ways actually made it harder for men to return.
Right.
I'm curious, as a feminist scholar, what lessons you learned during your mandate about the intersection between gender and counterterrorism, and how we can revise these narratives to better promote gender equality and peace and security.
Yeah, I mean, I think this kind of fusing together of security discourses and gender discourses are incredible. That's a very dense and long-standing space. Mm. You know, we have a large body of scholarly work on masculinities that addresses the way in which men and men's lives are structured in ways that create expectations and societal pressures on men, both to behave in particular kinds of ways, to engage in particular kinds of acts, and to be, in many ways, viewed as and be violent in society, making it very difficult for civilian men, for example, or boys to kind of opt out of these like incredibly patriarchal, but also highly determinative understandings of how men are structured, what their goals and desires are in society. And really what that has resulted in is the decoupling of men from the category of civilian. So there are multiple places around the world where men and boys, just by virtue of their sex, are not treated as civilians. And that was a particular concern of mine in the mandate. I'm the mom of 2 boys. I think this idea that that men are monolithic in terms of how they function in society, how they care about their families, how they live in relationship with others. Like, we have a highly deterministic absorption of views around men, both in international law and state practice. So some of the goal was to really try to move those narratives and shapes. The same is true for women, right? But we see 2 poles, I think, in the discourses around women around counterterrorism or terrorism. One is sort of a victimhood narrative that kind of characterizes women as always vulnerable, always preyed upon, always having very little autonomy. And actually, in some cases, that is true, right? Women who live in highly deterministic societies where they don't own property, they don't have a right to move without a man with them, they can't go to school. There are lots of things they simply cannot do without being in relationship with a man. Means that actually the way we understand choice and the way that choice actually exists for women in society is different. It's constrained. So as you said, that sometimes really it worked in a number of countries to convince states to bring back their women, because they literally couldn't see women as anything other than victims. But the flip side of that is then you can never see men as anything other than perpetrators, right? Mm-hmm. The flip side of that, of course, is that we had women who, pretty enthusiastically, and I mean, I've visited a lot of prisons and interviewed a lot of women, including women who were deeply radicalized and understood their role as sort of promoting and advancing a caliphate, right? They were not passive participants in the violence that took place under the caliphate. Many of them were beneficiaries of it. They were able to have benefits and they had enforcement. So even in highly constricted gender ideological spaces, it turns out that women have sometimes more autonomy than we think they do, right? And I think ISIS was a very, I don't want to overcredit Daesh, but it's to say that they were very smart about gender. They were very smart in how they recruited men and women, and they were very smart in terms of how they deployed women and men on the ground. How do we change that? It's really hard. I mean, it's actually particularly hard right now. We have several states, the United States, Russia, and in particular, who are vehemently opposed to actually the fundamental idea of gender equality. You've really got an alignment of very, very negative forces around women and men's rights, actually. And we see that at the UN by the stripping out of language, where the US or Russia, and again, there's a really interesting complementary patriarchy going on here between these two great powers and the men who lead them, who I think have very similar views on women's roles. So this is a really hard time to do that work. It's really hard. So what do? We keep documenting, we keep talking about it, but right now I think we're in a position where we're really struggling to maintain the norms that we have, and we're not making much progress on implementing them.
On improvement in this era. Yes.
Yeah.
I noticed in reviewing your reports as a special rapporteur that you often include the harm that happens to victims of terrorist attacks when talking about the harms of counterterrorism approaches.
Right.
For example, in your report on the visit to Guantanamo, you included a long section about what the U.S. government had done or not done to address the needs of 9/11 victims.
Right.
I'd be curious to hear your reflections on the importance of including the harms to victims from terrorist attacks in your advocacy of having more human rights compliant counterterrorism mechanisms by states.
Yeah, I mean, I think part of that focus on victims of terrorism comes from where I have spent most of my life, which is Belfast, Northern Ireland. And we had a long-running 30-year conflict, which was euphemistically called the Troubles, because we wouldn't actually say we had an armed conflict or conflict on our territory. And I think living in community with people who had been killed or injured, I had represented individuals who sought justice for family members who'd been killed by the state or by non-state armed groups during the conflict, and still do that work. So the victims of violence are really at the heart of what I have always been, I suppose, motivated by. International laws got better in terms of our recognition that victims of terrorism are a group, are rights-bearing, not just objects of pity or condolence or solidarity. And I have found often that victims of terrorism get really fatigued by those words, it's like thoughts and prayers. No, we don't really want your thoughts and prayers. What we want is to be treated as rights bearers who have an entitlement to certain things, which include the right to a remedy, the right to justice, the right to compensation, and the right to acknowledgement and dignity when we've been harmed. So I think the challenge we see is we see greater rhetoric around victims of terrorism, but often it shades into this sort of actually sort of protective, not a rights-bearing kind of place. And I certainly saw that with the victims of the 9/11 terrorist attack. And I have over the years, have made and maintained very close relationships with many of those victim families and groups. And, for those victims, what prevented them from getting justice was torture, right? Because the fact that the US government systematically tortured hundreds of Muslim men has meant that there's no justice for the victims. And so here we are, we're almost 2 decades and a half past 9/11. These families, many of them have lost family members. They are never going to see there's just no resolution. At best, there's a plea deal, which has now been compromised, right? But many of them will die without any sense of justice or accountability for the grievous harm that was done to them on that day. And that's a direct result of the state's choice to choose an illegal counterterrorism measure, commodifying the victims, like doing it in the victims' names, but actually fundamentally ensuring that those victims will, I think, never see the justice that they deserve. So I think one of the things that I feel we have to do is bring together the traditional human rights community with victims communities of terrorism, because often these two groups actually sit quite separately aside, and that difference is often used to undermine the collective rights project that they all have interests in. But yes, I mean, I think we see that in lots of places. I think we've seen it in 9/11. I would say we've also seen it on the 7th of October events in Israel. I think we've seen it in multiple terrorist attacks where the victims are used for the purposes of justifying state responses, but the victims themselves don't get the fundamental rights that they are entitled to, both under domestic and international law. Yeah.
You are a remarkably accomplished academic, and you're currently writing a book that's intended for a non-academic audience on your trip in Syria and what you learned there.
Yeah.
I'm curious about the choice that you made to write a non-academic book for a more general audience and what message you're hoping to convey to readers.
Yeah, so the book that I'm co-writing with a close friend and colleague who was my senior legal advisor, Anne Cherbourg, who led the Syria file in my office as special rapporteur. I think the choice to write this book was a recognition that I have written so many reports on Syria. I'm about to probably issue lots more reports on Syria in my new role. General Assembly reports, Human Rights Council reports, like we issued dozens and dozens of communications over many years, press releases, all kinds of sort of formal legal documents that were intended to compel states to do something different. And I wouldn't say that we didn't have success. I think we were able to do some things. But it feels to me that the idea that we have a place of detention that has literally has had over 70,000 people, it's now probably closer to about 40,000 people, the vast majority of whom are children under 18, who've never been subject to any legal process. Like, this is the blackest, deepest dark hole you can think of. Children who live a life where it's not just that the material conditions of confinement are grim. They live in tents, they have limited access to water, there's no education, childhood diseases are rampant, that we tolerate this as a society, and in fact, that multiple states are complicit in this kind of violation, multiple states who declare themselves to be champions of human rights, that it's simply intolerable. And so the choice to write a memoir, which is a story of a journey, it's called The Road to Qamishli. Qamishli is the town that we were based in northeast Syria, is really a way to try to engage a broader community, a broader group of people. Like, maybe it'll end up in an airport bookstore. That would be a great thing. Because I think that the only way we change narratives now is actually that often storytelling is the way that you do that, where you can really capture ordinary people's understanding of what's so profoundly wrong about this kind of behavior, what's so intolerable. These kinds of mass detentions are things we did in the Middle Ages. These are not the product of civilized societies. And ultimately, I think this is what really drives me, is that we sort of think that's over there. Well, that's in Syria. That doesn't affect us, right? But actually, as we've seen in this country in recent weeks and months, actually the arbitrariness of state power, the idea that in this country there are masked men running around with unmarked cars and no identification, snatching people off the streets. I mean, this to me is resonant of what I saw in Latin America in the 1980s and 70s and 80s. This is not what a democracy does. And the point is, I think the sort of permissiveness that created Guantanamo, that allowed Northeast Syria detention, that allowed, for example, Xinjiang, China to occur, actually has this insidious creep down into national practice, because allowing these things actually creates permission. And so I don't think they stay out there. I think they eventually come home. And none of us want to live in a society, because the point where you think, oh, well, that's just that person. It's not me. I'm never going to be subject to that. Actually, it's a fallacy. It's a fallacy. It's historically been a fallacy. It's a fallacy now. And so naming it in other places and telling that story about that other place is also a kind of a warning on, I think, the dangers of permissibility. So yeah, writing a different kind of book was really hard. I could write a law review article probably with my eyes closed, but maybe not a very good one. But this is a different kind of communication. And doing it with someone who's my colleague, who's such an extraordinary lawyer and friend, was a really incredible experience. So coming soon to a bookstore near you.
To an airport bookstore near you, hopefully. Yes. Well, I will look forward to reading it. And as we close, for those of us who are not special procedure mandate holders, who are regular people, what actions do you wish more people took to advocate for people in arbitrary detention in Syria, in Guantanamo, elsewhere, and to better promote the rule of law for all of us?
I mean, I have always believed that our commitment to the rule of law starts at home. So the heart of my work has always been in the place I grew up in, which is Ireland and Belfast, where I think you have to, what Eleanor Roosevelt once said it, you have to care about the places close to home, right? So when your neighbors are being swept into cars by masked men who don't have any ID and their cars aren't and won't identify themselves, then that's something you should care about as a decent citizen, as someone who wants to live in a society run by rules. So I would say start right where you are. And for me, I spent most of my life working in the place. When I went to law school, I started working on human rights issues. I never imagined I would end up working on human rights places far away. I started where I was. So that's always my advice, is start where you are. Don't look out there. Like, care about where you live. Care deeply about the rule of law where you live. And people have, it's not by accident. I think about it in this country in particular, where, what gave birth to the United States was the fear and concern about tyranny, understanding that the overuse of executive and monarchical power was fundamentally inconsistent with an open society. And I think people in this country should really care when their society starts to look more like the society that was rebelled against in the creation than anything else. So yeah, I would start right here.
On that note, I'd like to thank you for this wonderful, insightful conversation and for all the work that you've done to advocate for the rights of people in Minnesota, in Ireland, and across the globe.
Thanks.
Thank you.